If you recall, in one of my last videos, I was telling you guys how I slid into a curb when it was real icy out. It ended up bending the lower control arm and bending the ball joint stud. I had that replaced, and Les Schwab redid an alignment on the car, and so it's pretty much back to normal, except at highway speeds. Whenever I would load up the left side of the car, like in a corner, or even just going back and forth in your lane, I would hear this sound that sounded kind of like wah 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 wah, and it was always consistent at highway speeds loading up that side of the car. And so the best thing I could think of is it's probably the wheel bearing, and the guy at Les Schwab agreed. They quoted me about $280 to have the bearing installed with labor, and I bought the bearing myself and did it myself. It's cost me about $150, so I saved about $100. On a Subaru, to replace the wheel bearing, you have to replace the whole assembly. This is the factory Subaru wheel bearing assembly that I'll be using on my car. You're going to want a 17 and a 19mm socket, a breaker bar, and a few different extensions. Before you lift your car up, make sure you break loose your lug nuts. Lift the car and securely get it on a jack stand so that it's safe to work around. Now you can remove the lug nuts in the wheel and set them aside. This would be a really good time to spray a little bit of penetrating lubricant on the axle nut and around the disc flange. We need to remove these two bolts so that the whole caliper assembly can come off. This is where you're going to need a 17mm socket. Once you remove the two bolts, you can zip tie the caliper assembly to the coil spring up above just to get it out of the way. Unfortunately, brake discs are usually pretty tough to get off at first. They get corroded, and dust and dirt kind of gets them stuck onto the hub. The good news is that Subaru puts in two little threaded holes on the face of the disc that you can insert a screw in, and as you thread in the screw, it will pop the disc off of the hub. You can then remove your brake disc. Before I go any farther, I want to spray some penetrating lubricant on the 4 bolts that need to come out to remove the wheel bearing assembly from the spindle. Now with a screwdriver or a punch and a hammer, you can gently remove the stake mark that's on the axle nut. With a 32mm socket, remove the axle nut. It's easiest to use an impact gun for this. Once the axle nut is off, you can see that the drive shaft will move freely inside of the wheel bearing. Next, break loose the 4 bolts holding the wheel bearing on with a 14mm socket and a breaker bar. Once you get all 4 of those bolts out, then comes the fun part. You gotta beat the wheel bearing hub assembly off. The bigger the hammer, the better, but as you can see here, I just used a regular hammer and eventually got it off. Have patience and try not to hit the brake shield right behind it. It's rust, dust, and corrosion that gets these stuck on there so tight. Putting it on is not that hard. Gently pry the brake shield off of the old wheel bearing. Give it a good wipe just to get all the dust and dirt off. Checking out the old wheel bearing, I can't hear or feel any sort of problems with it. It feels pretty smooth. This little guy sticking out is your wheel speed sensor. You need to be very careful not to damage this or you're going to be replacing it. It could break easy if you were to hit it hard. It's a good idea to clean up the spindle and the drive shaft. Get it nice and clean, free of dirt and debris, so that we can install the new wheel bearing. I applied a really thin, small amount of grease to help the wheel bearing slide on. And also a little bit of anti-seize onto the drive shaft splines. Put the brake shield onto the new wheel bearing, make sure you orient it correctly, and install the wheel bearing assembly. Now it's time to reinstall the 4 bolts that hold the wheel bearing on. It's best to put the 4 bolts in loosely at first and then go back and snug them down in a crisscross pattern. Then you can torque them. When it comes to installing the axle nut, I just used a piece of 2x4 to keep the wheel bearing from spinning, and then torqued it down. Then you can use a screwdriver or a punch to stake the axle nut down so it won't back off. Reinstall your brake disc. Cut the zip tie holding your brake caliper up out of the way, and then you can reinstall the caliper assembly over the disc, and we'll reinstall the 2 bolts and torque them down. And then we just have to reinstall the wheel. put the lug nuts on and snug them down. Give the wheel a spin just to listen for any odd sounds. You can then lower your car and torque your lug nuts. And now you just need to go for a test drive. Okay guys, it's important to get out and test drive your vehicle and make sure it's handling good and make sure your brakes are working good. You need to be careful, but you need to make sure that there's nothing abnormal. I'm about to test here at highway speeds, going about 65, and this corner always produced the sound and I am not hearing it. Here we go. I think we got rid of it. I'm not hearing it anymore, which is great. Thanks for watching, you guys. I hope this video helps somebody out. Feel free to hit the subscribe button and check out the other Subaru maintenance videos I've got. Thanks, guys.